Last week I completely tore apart the transmission from my 1986 Toyota 4Runner. Today we're going to reassemble it with a parts kit that includes brand new bearings, synchros, gaskets, and seals. This thing should be as good as new once we're done. Picking up right where we left off, in the last video I tore apart this entire transmission out of my 1986 Toyota 4Runner because all the bearings are bad. Since then I've picked up a brand new parts kit that comes with all of the bearings, synchros, seals, and gaskets to put that thing back together and get it in perfect working order. And I also picked up some lubricants to help aid in that process. So what we're going to do is we're going to start reassembling this thing in reverse order starting right now. Second gear was the last gear we took off of the main shaft, so it's the first gear we're going to put on. One of the things that you'll remember is that since I had bearings that blew up in the transmission, everything has metal shavings, and you can see this is kind of notchy when it moves. So I need to take out this retaining ring and the keys out of this hub and get it cleaned up before I put everything back on that shaft. And I'm gonna do this for every single other hub in the transmission too, but I'm only gonna film it on this one, so I just wanted to show you guys how I do it. So I don't know how well you can see this, but I made a notch on the actual inside of the hub itself and the outside so I can line it back up when I put it back together. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pry this little snap ring out of here and then take these keys out, get everything cleaned up, and then put it back together the exact same way. So now that everything's clean and the metal shavings are out, you can see this moves in here freely with no notchiness. So now we can put the keys and the retaining rings back into this hub assembly. Now I've mentioned it before, I'm gonna mention it again because I don't wanna take credit for something that I didn't originally post or learn. I learned a lot of what I'm doing right now from two people primarily, and it's Gearbox Video and Austin Naimala. Hopefully I'm saying your name right, dude. I apologize if I butchered that. But I learned a lot of this from YouTube, and I'm just replicating what I learned. So the credit of putting this thing back together goes to them. This is not something that I knew how to do before the video. Anyway, with that said, we're gonna put this back together now. So these keys go into the hub facing this way. So you're just gonna slide them in there, all three of them. Just like that. And then the ring, what you're gonna do is you're gonna catch this little lip on the edge of the key, like that, and you're just gonna maneuver it in place, just until it holds those keys down. Just like that. Then you're gonna flip it over, and on the other side, we're going to insert the ring the opposite way. So you see how this one is on the left side? We're gonna insert the ring on the other side, on the right side, just to offset it. And that's how it was from the factory too, by the way. All right, that is good to go. All right, so now I'm ready to install second gear on the main shaft. I have these new Synchro rings here, and I wasn't going to install one on this gear because this one seemed to be good, but the more that I look at it, it actually, sometimes it catches when I put pressure, and you can see there, sometimes it just doesn't catch. So I am gonna replace this Synchro ring right here. Before I do that, I'm gonna just grab some 2500 grit sandpaper and just smooth out this surface right here. Now with the new synchronizer ring, we can see when we put it on here, there's no side to side movement. It fits really well. And when we put some pressure on it, this thing really, really locks up. So this is a good ring right here, and we're gonna go ahead and install second gear now. Just gonna take some of this lubriplate grease right here and lube up the area where the bearing will go, and then drop that needle bearing onto there. Put a little bit more grease on that. All right, now we're gonna drop second gear onto that bearing. Nice. I'm just using a little bit of gear oil to lubricate this surface where the synchronizer ring sits, and then we're gonna put the Synchro on. Yeah, that one locks up really well. All right, from this point we can take the hub. Now the hub, I had to actually go back into my last video to see how this thing goes. The rounded side right here faces down. The square side faces up. So we're gonna take this thing and put it on this way. All right, and the little area where the keys are in the hub line up with the notches in the Synchro ring. So this is gonna sit on here like this. We might have to get it started with some hammer taps, but we're gonna have to take it to the press and press this thing on once we get it started. This is how we're gonna press the hub and the gear on. Well, the hub really, the gear of course is a slip fit, but the hub has to be pressed on. So the shaft sits inside of this tube. I use this tube sometimes for driving bearings or seals or something, and it just so happens that the shaft fits perfectly inside of it. You could use a race or something else as well, but essentially we're gonna drive this down, and this is gonna force this assembly up. And when I was talking about the keys earlier, how you want to line them up in the hub, you can see that there's little notches in the Synchro there. And those notches need to line up with the area in the hub as well. So you can see right here, we have the area where the key is, and you want the Synchro to line up with it like this. And it'll fall in there. You see how it fell in there? And that's how you know you're ready to press. All right, so now it's time to put first gear on, and one of the things you'll probably remember from the last video is this little hole that's in the shaft and this ball that we took out of it. And this ball sits in this shaft and it prevents this race, if you want to call it that, from sliding. So you'll see there's a little groove inside of the race right here. And basically the ball sits in the groove like this, and it prevents it from spinning around when the shaft is spinning, so it keeps this piece stationary. So we need to get this ball in the shaft and first gear slid onto here without this coming out. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna cover it in grease and stick it in its hole. And I have this thing up on blocks here because I thought it might make it easier. It might end up making it harder, but we'll adjust as I see fit. If I need to move it, I will. All right, so the ball's in there. Put a little bit more on there just for insurance so it doesn't move. Okay. And then we have this collar and the bearing. Be really careful when you're handling these bearings. I dropped this thing earlier and every single one of the rollers flew out, and I had to go through the entire garage with a magnet and sweep the floor to find them, and then put the whole thing back together, like snap them back in the cage. So these things will go flying if you drop them, so be careful. All right, so now I have to get the Synchro ring into place. I decided I'm gonna replace all the rings. These rings fit pretty well and I trust them, so I'm gonna go ahead and install all of them. I need to line it up with the keys just like last time. So the notches in the ring are gonna line up with the areas on the actual hub where the keys are. So there's an order of how this has to go together. You can't put on the collar and that needle bearing until the gear is on. So we gotta put on the gear next. And actually, let me lubricate this mating surface right here where the Synchro will go. We're gonna slide on first gear, holding the Synchro in place. This probably would have been easier if I just did it standing up on its end. I would do that next time if I were you. And the ball is facing up, so we know what way to orient the sleeve and the bearing. There we go. Now we're gonna put on the new main bearing. I've had this thing out baking in the sun. Hopefully it just drops right on. See if we get lucky. We did not get lucky. Let me see if I can knock this thing into place with my little slammer tool here. I'm not gonna go too hard with it. Yeah, that's about all I'm willing to force it, so we're gonna toss this into the press. All right, so just a couple things when you're pressing bearings on. You always want to use a race or some sort of socket or spacer that pushes down the inside of the bearing. You never want to push from the outside housing of the bearing here. And another thing is to make sure that this snap ring groove is facing this way, because you're gonna have to fasten the snap ring here once you get this assembly back in the mid plate. So with that said, let's start pressing this thing on. At this point, we have the second gear installed along with its synchronizer ring, the clutch hub and slider, the first gear synchronizer, and first gear and the main bearing. So how do we know everything in there is working as it's intended to? Well, if we line up the gear with the Synchro, we should be able to put this in gear like that. And at this point, you can see this is where the key goes. It's lined up with the other Synchro too. So we should be able to put it into this gear as well. So everything here, from my perspective, looks good to go, and we're ready to move forward. Now it's time to conquer the culprit of this entire problem, which is the input bearing here for fourth gear on the input shaft. This is the bearing that failed and caused the whole issue that we're having here, and the reason why we're rebuilding the transmission. So I have this socket here, not only because it makes up room in the press and I don't have to crank the actual jack as long, but because the front of the input shaft right here goes in the pilot bearing, and I don't want to flare it out or like mushroom it or anything like that. So we're gonna press this off, put the new bearing on, and then get started on third and fourth on the main shaft. All right, so I went ahead and I pressed that input bearing on the input shaft off camera. Didn't want to bore you guys with another press. Just put the bearing on there and we're good to go. Got the snap ring back on. Now I want to show you something with my third gear Synchro that came with the kit. So this is the OEM Synchro right here, and this is the one that came with the kit. The OEM Synchro, it locks up. It's a good Synchro ring. It doesn't have any issues. It's a nice fit. Now, the aftermarket one locks up too, but the thing that it does that I really don't like is it has a lot of play like this. And the OEM ring doesn't do that. You put this one on here, it is a really solid fit. So for third and fourth gear, well, for fourth gear I have to replace it because it's all chewed up from the bad bearing, but for third gear at least, I'm gonna stick with the OEM synchronizer ring here because it works perfectly fine. So I'm just gonna drop third gear right on like this. I'm gonna get my OEM synchronizer ring because, as I said, I really don't like the way that aftermarket one fits, and this one still works just fine. And now let me just set this to the side real quick and explain something. Hopefully that doesn't fall. You'll remember on the 1 and 2 assembly that the slider and the clutch hub face a certain way. The flat face of it kind of pointed toward the output shaft. Well, on the 3-4, the flat face points toward the input shaft, so it's gonna go this way. The flat face, well, they're kind of both flat, but the flat side that has the little lip on it's gonna face the input shaft. So this is also, the actual inside of it, the hub matters too. You see this side has a thicker collar and this side has a thinner collar. So make sure if you take this thing apart to clean it up or whatever that you get it back the right way. So we're just gonna drop this on there, aligning the keys with the Synchro ring. I'm gonna get it started a little bit with some taps, and then I'm gonna drive the rest of it down with the press. Same old story at this point, just pressing it on, making sure that the keys in the Synchro or the little recess areas align with the keys in the hub, and just doing it real slow to make sure nothing looks out of whack. I'm gonna check it one more time. Now all that's left for this part is to get this snap ring on. If I remember correctly, this one was kind of annoying, not because of the kind of snap ring that it is, but because this area was a little rusty, I tried cleaning it up as best as I could, and hopefully this goes on a little easier than it came off. There we go. Oh, not all the way, but most of the way, at least snapped in there. Kind of an annoying fit. I actually ended up taking that snap ring back off, putting it in the vise to kind of tighten it up, and then I whacked it back on with a socket that was the same diameter as the snap ring. And I heard a really nice audible snap, and I feel a lot more comfortable in this thing staying put now. So that's about as far as we're gonna go on the main shaft right now. There's no point to really put on fourth gear and the input shaft yet because it kind of just floats on the end of the main shaft here. And we need to put together all of the gears and everything and the bearings and whatnot on the cluster shaft and get that in place, and then insert both the main shaft and cluster shaft into the mid plate together. So we're gonna get started on the cluster shaft now. Now I'm moving on to the cluster shaft, and there's a couple things I have to do to this before we can move forward. So I need to replace this bearing right here next to the counter gear, and there's also a bearing and a race that goes on right here in this middle journal, and it's a split bearing, so it kind of clamps around it like that, and the race slides over the end like this. Once that is done, we can install the input gear and fourth gear onto the end of our main shaft, put both of the shafts together, and install them through the intermediate plate. It's worth mentioning that this bearing is going to come with a spacer that may or may not fit your transmission. I'm assuming that these bearings probably fit a wide range of Toyota transmissions, and for the W56 at least, this does not fit properly, so I used the old one. Moving on to the split bearing now, so I'm just going to lubricate this journal where it rides. So the bearing actually pulls apart. You can see there's a little crease in it right here. And the bearing will just pull apart like this. And we're gonna snap it back on like this. Got a nice little click there. Make sure it's actually snapped together. Looking good. I'm gonna lubricate this a little bit more. All right, now we're gonna slide the race on with the groove pointing towards the end of the shaft, so like this. It slides right over, and it just rides on the bearing like that. So now we're ready to install the input gear onto the main shaft. Now, as I mentioned before, I was very reluctant to use the 3/4 Synchros because they didn't fit very well, but in this case, I do have to use the new Synchro because you can see the old one is damaged there. You can kind of see the little, it's screwed up on the edge right there, as well as other areas. It just kind of got eaten up by that bad bearing. So we're gonna replace this one with a new Synchro. And another thing is I'm gonna use a little bit heavier of a grease to hold these keys in place and just keep the Synchro in this area like this. So it actually stays aligned with the keys and doesn't fall out or move when we're installing these shafts into the intermediate plate. So I'm gonna go ahead and just put little blobs on the keys like this just to keep it in place, because I really don't want that thing to move when I'm installing these shafts into the plate. Test this Synchro real quick. It locks up really nicely. Now the thing that I was saying I don't like about it is the fact that it kind of wobbles like that, but this is what we're gonna have to use. All right, so we're gonna align this with those keys that I just greased up. And then we're gonna take this pilot slash cartridge bearing, whatever you wanna call it, grease it up and put it into the end of the input shaft right here. All right, now with both of these assemblies fully together, we can slide them into the intermediate slash mid plate. It's kind of hard to do by yourself, so I'm gonna go enlist my girlfriend to help me with this. I'm gonna put this main shaft through. Just kind of rest it there like that for a second. Grab this cluster shaft. Wash for your shirt. Okay, pick up that end like upward. Yeah, so we can get this thing through. Hold on. They both have to align. All the gears have to mesh. And you kind of have to wiggle them in together. Oh, that was so easy. Are the little snap ring grooves showing? All right, we're done. That's it. That seems like it was too easy, huh? Mm-hmm. I know, I thought it was gonna be a lot harder. Wow, cool. The shafts are in, and I gotta be honest, those went in a lot easier than I expected them to. Having help really goes a long way. So now we're installing the snap rings on the main bearing and the cluster shaft bearing, or at least we're trying to. And then after that, we can move forward. All right, now we're gonna install the rear bearing retainer. Just sits on here like this. Same way we took it off, and just reinstall those Torx 40 bolts. I have a little bit of thread locker on these things. Toyota doesn't call for it in the manual, but just put it on there just to be safe. And these are gonna torque to 13 foot-pounds per the manual, but I'm gonna torque them at 15. I don't know if you guys remember or not, but the reverse gear was really hard to get off of the shaft when I tore it all apart. So what I'm doing, because I don't have a bearing heater and I don't want to put it in my stove in the house, is I'm actually heating up the bearing on my camping stove. Let me show you what we got going on here. We have the reverse gear on my camping stove. This was a really hard gear to get off, and I don't know how I'm gonna press it on to that shaft. And then to make things worse, we're gonna hold this with gardening gloves instead of actual welding gloves, and we're gonna slide this thing on. I went a little bit too hard when I was heating that gear up. You can see it kind of started turning blue. So I went over there and I saw it turning that color, and I quickly took it off of the stove and rushed it over and put it on this shaft. It should be fine. I just got to make sure that I'm not getting the other gears that hot. And we're just going to install this snap ring and then move on to fifth gear. Alright, so obviously I made a very stupid mistake right there and I paid the price. I was getting very impatient. I had been working on the transmission all day and I just wanted to finish it and get the job done. I could feel that pipe slipping and hitting the bearing cage. I just kept hitting it anyway. And here I am now a week later with a brand new OEM bearing. I'm driving it on with some heat and a punch, went on with no issues. And right now I'm just installing that snap ring, couple hammer taps and it goes right on. And that bearing's installed with no damage at all. The last thing that goes onto this shaft is this output shaft sleeve. So this thing actually hammers on to the end of those splines and it goes all the way up to the bearing where that snap ring is. And there should be no shaft showing right there. It should be completely flush fit. Now the reason why I didn't record that is because I didn't want to bore you guys with more hammering. The thing just hammers on. It's really easy to get on there. And once you have that done, we're finished with the main shaft and we can move to the 5th gear components for the counter shaft. So we have the clutch hub right here. And if you watched the last video when we took this all apart, what you'll remember is this thing, all the keys flew out of it when we took it off. So to get them back in there, you're gonna do just like we did at the beginning of the video, but the difference with this one is that it has this little retaining ring on the back, and you could kind of pry that off with the flathead screwdriver and then just put the spring and the keys in the right place and you should be good to go. Other than that, we have the spacer, snap ring, the counter gear, Synchro, another spacer, a bearing, and a snap ring that we have to put on to this counter shaft. And once that's done, the main section of the transmission is complete and we can get ready to put it in the cases once we finish installing the shift rails, of course. So this thing should just hammer on. It shouldn't be that hard to get on there, but it's not just gonna slide on with no effort. I'm always scared tapping on the transmission this much because there's all these little keys and springs, as you guys have seen, that can fly out. Oh, that's not gonna work. I gotta get something else to hammer this thing on. So I don't know, it just kind of makes me a little bit nervous just always hitting things onto this transmission, but I guess that's just, you know, how it is. It's how you have to do it. We have to get this snap ring on, but the part that makes this sketchy is that you kind of have to push this hub back over. And the risk here is that you can actually knock these keys off of the spring, and then you'll have to remove this whole unit to get everything, you know, back together with the key and the spring. So be really careful as you kind of push this slider over the hub to get it kind of out of the way to get this snap ring on. Just gonna tap it right on there and hopefully not have any issues. This might go catastrophically wrong, we're about to see. Got it. So since we were doing so much banging and hammering in this area and things could have got dislodged, let me show you how you can make sure that the keys and springs are still in the right place. So we're gonna take the Synchro, we're gonna put it in place, line it up with those keys. And if I put the gear in there, if I can keep the Synchro in place, if I put the gear in here, we should be able to put it in gear. And when we put it in gear, you'll be able to see if the keys are gonna come out or not. On the side of the hub right here, I'll show you a closer shot, but on the side of the hub, you're gonna be able to see if the keys are kind of like cockeyed or they're wanting to fly out of there. And as long as they're flat and they look pretty sturdy and secure in that clutch hub, they're not gonna go anywhere. Since everything looks good here, we can move on to the spacer and getting that needle bearing ready to install. I'm just gonna use some lube to hold the needle bearing in place. Just a big old glob of it here. Hold this guy on. And then flip it over, hopefully it doesn't fall off. We're looking good. And another big old glob of it here to hold the top half of it on. Just like that. I did decide to use a new Synchro for 5th gear. This one fits really well. So at this point we have 3 brand new Synchros, right? 4 actually. The only one that we didn't replace is 3rd gear. All right, and I put some grease on the little areas where the keys go so this thing doesn't move, because there is going to be more hammering and tapping here in the very near future. All right, so we're just going to slide this into place. Okay, then we can slide our gear on. Just like that. Spacer. This is not just gonna fit, this is gonna be a tap. Once my glove gets out of there. My lunch lady gloves got stuck under the spacer right there. Give it a little tap to get it started. All right, once that spacer's on, nothing's gonna move. There is nothing that's gonna fall into place because this is so tightly, it's not really pressed, but it is a tight fit over the shaft. So once this spacer's on, nothing that you did before is gonna move at this point. So now we just have to get the bearing on and the snap ring. So I do have a brand new bearing for this too. So here's the old one. This is the only bearing that actually felt good in that entire transmission, but we're gonna replace it because I do have a new one. And the very last piece of this puzzle, for this part at least, is the snap ring. Just making sure I don't stretch it out. Just very gently slide it over. Nice, just gonna push it into place. Hey guys, just a quick interruption here. If you guys are enjoying this content, please feel free to subscribe to the channel. I post a lot of how-to videos, build videos, and truck videos, mainly revolving around Toyotas. So if you're into that kind of thing, hit that subscribe button. Thanks. Do you guys remember these little pins right here? These have to go back in now. These are the interlock pins. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna drop them through this top cavity and they're gonna slide down into their respective areas. So there's a short one that goes right here and there's a long one that goes right here. So just like the first time when we tore it apart, we're gonna stuff some paper towels in each of these to hold everything in place. So I'm gonna put in the short one first, and I'm gonna use a magnet and kind of insert it from the side instead of dropping it down in there. Because if I drop it in here, it can bounce around, it's gonna go on the floor, I'll never find it. So hopefully I can get it in this way. Gonna kind of push it down in there. Okay, and then we're gonna stuff this with a towel. Now the long one's really easy to drop down in there because it can't fall out, so we're just gonna plop it down this hole. And there it goes. And we'll insert a towel in that top hole as well. And then we can get started on installing the shift rails. So now we can get started on installing all these rails and gears and forks and balls and detents and push pins and all this crap. This was by far the most confusing part for me. Installing the gears and everything was a lot easier, if I'm being honest, than taking out the shift rails. I don't know, maybe that's just my brain. But the reverse gear right here, the collared end where that little like arm goes, it faces this way. And then the actual shaft, there's a notch in it right here, and the notch side also is going to face towards the input shaft. So just put it together like this. And one thing you'll remember is we left this snap ring on. If you took it off, go ahead and put it back on. And we're just going to take the whole unit and we're going to put it in just like this. And just kind of leave it in place for now. We'll get everything else in place in a few seconds. All right, so the next 3 parts are going to be the shift rail, this arm linkage thingamabobber, and the actual shift fork itself. So if you take a look at this shift rail, you can see there's little indentations or grooves in it on the outside here and on the top. Now these are corresponding with the side detent ball that goes in right here. It just rides in these little areas right here, and then the top one is corresponding with the interlock that's in this chamber right here that we stuffed the towels in. So this is oriented in this plate like this. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna install this, and then we're gonna slide this little arm thingamabobber over it. Now, if you'll remember, this sat in there something like this. It sits in there on the actual bearing retainer and on the gear like that. And then after that, we'll get the actual shift fork on. So we're inserting the shift rail right now. We're just pushing the towel out as we're shoving the rod through. And this will allow us to keep that interlock in place. Just like that. We should be able to feel it. Yeah, you can feel it drop into the actual shift rail right there. Cool. So let's leave that right here, and then we'll get that little arm thingamabobber on. When we took this off, there was yet another detent ball that came out of it, so we need to make sure this goes back in and doesn't move. You could put it on right now, or you can put it on later. It doesn't really matter, but it's gonna have to go in there. So I'm just gonna fill that cavity up with grease to hold that ball in place. Just gonna shove it in there. And it shouldn't move, but we'll see. So this is gonna go on like this. We're going to feed it onto this collar here. Might have to move the rail out of the way, just slightly. Get it onto the gear as well. Push the rail through. Just like that. And then the actual, I'm making sure that ball is not gonna fall out. Maybe put a little bit more grease on that ball. So now the shift rail goes on, and it goes on like this. So we need to get this in place onto the collar here. Then we're just gonna slide it through. With the shift fork on, you know it's in the right place because there's that little area that we removed the roll pin from, and you can see the hole when you look through the top of the shift fork here that everything's aligned. You can also feel that the interlock pin down here is almost flush with this surface, and it's not sticking out. So once that's all set, we can take the last rod. Yes, there are 3 different rod components associated with fifth gear in reverse, but this one is gonna go in last. And same thing as before, the notched end goes through the mid plate. We're just gonna take this and just send it right through this section right here, just like that. And now we need to install the roll pin on the shift fork. The last piece of this puzzle is to install this hold down plate. It sits within the grooves of those 2 shafts that we already installed. So you might have to turn them to get it aligned, but once you're about here, you can go ahead and install the bolt. It's a 14 millimeter, and we're gonna torque it to 20 foot-pounds. I believe Toyota calls for 18, but we're gonna round up to 20 and call it good. Moving on to the 3/4 rail, we have another tiny little interlock pin that's very easy to lose. This goes in the middle of this shaft right here. You can see I filled the cavity with grease. So we're just gonna put it in there, and it shouldn't go anywhere. And now we can install this rail. So what we're gonna do is the same thing that we did on the 5th and reverse rail. We're going to feed it through this way with the little grooves facing outwards, and we're going to kind of push this rag out as we shove the rail through, just to make sure that we get that interlock. Now, if this towel comes out and there's no interlock with it, then the interlock is still in the plate. I have a problem where I'll double check things a million times. I'll like million check things. It can't go anywhere. It has to be in there if you took the towel out and the rod went through. So now we're just making sure that the other interlock stays in there. And don't forget your actual shift fork. So the 3/4 shift fork, make sure you don't forget it. This goes through like this. The bolt hole faces up. And you're gonna guide the rail through just like this. Might have to wiggle it a little bit. Now I'm just gonna check to make sure that pin is still in there one more time. I told you I like million check things. Okay, it's in there. I'm just gonna shimmy it through right here. Just like that. Now we can put the bolt in as well as the locking tab for that shift fork. It went in this way previously. Just kind of tighten that by hand for now, if it decides to. There we go. Just gonna tighten this by hand. Okay, and now I need to install the snap ring. This just taps on with the hammer. It's gonna look a little awkward because I'm working around a camera, but you just kind of hammer it down like this. Like that. And now we're done. All right, now we can move on to the 1/2 shift fork. We can remove this top plug with the towel because the interlock is only gonna fall down. It's not gonna fall up. It was just meant to keep it in place so it didn't fall down or move anywhere in there. So this is the easiest rail in my opinion. Same thing, the actual grooves are gonna face the outside of the plate right here, and then the bottom groove is going to point downwards facing that interlock. So we're gonna start feeding it through and grab our shift fork. This one goes this way. We're gonna install the locking tab and the bolt. Last thing will be knocking that snap ring on, and there we go. Now that all the shift rails are installed, we can go ahead and install the detent balls and springs and the caps that go on those areas there. I already installed the top one previously, and these are gonna torque to 20 foot-pounds. And I also already torqued it down and installed the locking plates on both the shift forks, and those go to 14 foot-pounds, but I just put them at 15. And also, you probably only need to bend one of those tabs, not both of them. It's not gonna move. So each one of these has their own ball and spring. Remember, they're all unique, so you cannot mix and match them. The ball goes in first, followed by the plug. I have a little bit of black RTV on the plug just to seal these because transmission fluid can seep past them. Now we're gonna go to 3 and 4. And finally, 5th and reverse. And these, once again, these torque to 20 foot-pounds. All right, so now this is all completely back together. We can start working on getting this installed in the case half. So I'm gonna do this tail housing section first. There's a seal here we have to replace, and there's also a race that we have to replace that works with this bearing right here. So on the inside, let me flip this thing over. There's a race right here, and there's usually a snap ring on top of it. I already removed it. If you just kind of pry it away from the body of the unit with a flathead and get it out with a hooked screwdriver or like a little hook tool, you can get that thing out of there. And then we're gonna knock the race out and replace the seal on the back side. Should be able just to pop this seal out with a flathead screwdriver. Just like that. And now we are gonna knock the race out from the inside out. So I don't have a punch long enough, so I'm gonna use a flathead. It's already about to come out of there. There we go. So here's the old race and here's the new race. To install the new race, I'm just gonna use one of these little driver tools, set the race in there, just like that. And then tap it in with the hammer. It's a very easy fit, and then we'll get the snap ring back in there. All right, and the new race is installed. Now we're gonna put the new seal in. Make sure the seal is all greased up on the inside, and then we'll put it into the housing right here. All right, the new seal and the new race are in, and now we can put the transmission into this case half. So at this point, I have the transmission ready to go, as well as both of the case halves cleaned, so that when we put everything together, we don't have to spend any time cleaning up gasket surfaces or anything like that. As for the actual paper gasket itself, I glued it on using this Permatex high tack so it doesn't move when we're installing the case. And before we can install this rear case half on, we have to set this rod in place. So this rod just kind of lays in this little area right here in the shift forks. And you have to guide it through this hole as you're putting the case half on. So we're gonna go ahead and install this rear case half right now. All right, so once I start putting this case half on and this rod starts going through it, I'll be able to see the little threads in the rod to start threading this thing onto it. So I'm just gonna start guiding it on. All right, so as you can see, when you're sliding this on, the rod will come through, and then you can tighten that little extension piece on right there. And then you can push the rest of the case half on. Also, don't put it on backward like me. That was the wrong way. This is how it's supposed to go on. All right, now I'm ready to put on the front case section. One thing to note is that the input shaft can move and this Synchro ring can fall out of place. So make sure that thing is in place before you do this. In fact, I'm gonna check mine again. It's still in the keys. All right, and another thing I did was I greased up both of the bearings and the shift rod so that this thing slides on a little bit easier. So we should just be able to slide this thing right on. I have the gaskets all glued on, and I have a little bit of that same gasket high tack stuff on the mid plate itself here as well. All right, now I'm gonna start drawing it together with a couple of the case bolts just so it doesn't move. The case bolts are gonna torque to 30 foot-pounds. Now that the cases are back together, we can get started on installing the snap rings that hold the bearings to this part of the case and then the bearing retainer. The bearing retainer itself has a seal inside of it right there. You can see this rubber seal. Make sure that you replace that. And then it also has a paper gasket as well. And the bolts that actually hold the retainer to the case, they go all the way into the transmission. So I have black silicone on those bolts so that they don't leak. With the snap rings installed, we can move on to this bearing retainer. We got the seal greased up on the inside just to make sure that it doesn't get torn on the shaft or anything. And we're just gonna set it in place and then put in our bolts. These bolts are gonna get torqued to 18 foot-pounds. So at this point, the transmission's actually done besides putting the transfer case and bell housing on and installing it in the truck. But I wanted to install the shifter housing just to make sure that everything works and it shifts into gear. So in this rubber plate, there's these little washers that sit inside of the plate, and they can fall out and fall in the transmission. Make sure you don't drop them in there and ruin everything that you just did. All right, so this is the first time we're shifting it into any gear. We did not do this off camera. This is gonna reveal if this thing works or if it doesn't. So here's first gear. Oh, there's first gear. Second gear. Back into neutral. Third gear. Fourth gear. Fifth gear. And reverse. Hard to move it right now, probably because everything in there is dry, but yeah, it goes into every gear and works fine. All right guys, that's gonna wrap it up for this video. I know this was a really long one. I haven't tossed it in the editor yet, but I'm assuming this is around 30 minutes or so. So if you stuck around throughout the entire thing, thank you. Hopefully you were able to learn something. I know I learned a lot along the way. Also, I post a lot of off-roading content, build videos, how-tos, all revolving around Toyota. So if you're into that kind of thing, hit that subscribe button and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Later. Oh, success. I know this is a really long video. I haven't edited it yet,